Few of us can honestly say that we're not afraid to die. It's a lingering sort of fear, one that can be sufficiently tucked away and buried beneath the time of our daily lives, and it only rears its head every once in a while in more quiet, desperate moments. This isn't everyone's experience, of course. Sometimes that fear transforms itself into a sickly sense of anxiety that holds us back from life, that coalesces into a seemingly insurmountable roadblock in the way of living our lives. We might neglect to go out of our homes simply because, on some level, the world feels like a frightening thing that offers us only a life of suffering or a loss of that life altogether. Now, personally, I am not someone that possesses extensive experience with this sort of dilemma, but I'm someone who more than once has found themselves unable to drift into the comfort of sleep because the itch of worry at the idea of dying demands I make the mental effort to scratch it. In these moments, I only wish that I could drift away into a dream and free myself from the worries that my waking mind forces me to think about. For I know that upon waking, my fears will be dashed by the light of the morning sun. But while I inevitably wake up in my bed, Donnie Darko finds himself waking up on a golf course. Certainly an odd thing to happen, though this turns out to be perhaps the luckiest sleepwalk to have been unconsciously undertaken. As when Donnie returns home, he finds that where he should have been sleeping now sits a jet engine that fell from the sky and into his home. Now, the reason for all of this happening is certainly something I and many others didn't exactly predict when we first watched this film, but before exploring the strange and confusing path that Donnie's story takes, let's walk back a few steps. Donnie Darko is written and directed by Richard Kelly, who in 28 days created an amazing synthesis of science fiction and a coming-of-age film. Kelly takes these two genres and uses their elements to weave together a tale that shows Donnie overcome the terror of dying. Instead of a generalized possibility of dying, we are given a very specific amount of time until the world will end.
28 days, 6 hours, 42 minutes, 12 seconds. That is when the world will end.
The film is rife with references to death and destruction. There is, of course, the apocalypse that Frank warns Donnie of, and other things like the character Grandma Death, who is the main source of knowledge regarding the science fiction elements of the movie. Grandma Death cryptically whispers something in Donnie's ear, and it turns out to be that she told him,
"She said that every living creature on Earth dies alone."
Much of Donnie's own actions are related to destruction, from flooding the school to burning down Jim Cunningham's mansion. There are smaller elements weaved in as well, such as the story of Watership Down being the main focus of Donnie's English class, which itself involves a story of a destructive flood. Of course, the movie ends with Donnie's own death and the reactions of his friends and family members. To fully understand how Kelly takes us on a journey of accepting death, we must look to the dualistic nature of Donnie Darko, the martyr and the man. When it comes to media with parallelisms to religion, one of the most common implementations of theological storytelling is that of a Christ metaphor. God, religion, and Christ are all frequently discussed topics in the film. The separation of religion and science is evident through Grandma Death, who Donnie's science teacher explains was once a nun that left the faith to go teach science instead. This frames there to be a sort of dichotomy. One is either fully in the camp of science or the camp of religion. After being told by Grandma Death that everyone dies alone, this creates a sort of crisis of faith for Donnie. As previously mentioned, he tells his therapist that the search for God is absurd if we wind up in solitude when we die. There are further biblical leanings in the story. Donnie's flooding of the school can be easily paralleled to the Great Flood in the story of Noah's Ark. The fire put to Jim Cunningham's house is similar to God's annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Jim Cunningham himself is the picture of a false prophet, the exact thing that Matthew 7:15 warns us of. Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Cunningham even sports his own sort of religion in the form of his fear and love dichotomy, attributing every emotion we experience to be placed neatly in one of the two categories. Donnie openly rejects this, and even goes so far as to invoke more biblical language to admonish Cunningham's deception.
I think you're fucking Antichrist.
While it's obvious on the surface that Jim is preaching a false sort of religion, his dubious nature is confirmed to in fact be a diabolical one when it's discovered that he possesses a den of CP. Where the metaphor of Donnie as Christ truly comes into play is in respect to his status as the living receiver. The story of the movie takes place in what's called a tangent universe, basically a corrupted branch off the primary universe. Donnie must return an object called the artifact back to the primary universe. Otherwise, the unstable tangent universe will become even more corrupt and destroy everything altogether. While normally this would come without personal cost, unfortunately the artifact in question is the jet engine which fell into Donnie's room. In returning the engine to the primary universe, he will also have to return himself to the spot where it would crash and kill him. So, like Jesus on the cross to die for the sake of our sins, Donnie must come to accept his fate and sacrifice himself in order to save everyone else. If he doesn't go through with this, it would appear that Donnie would be the only thing left in the universe.
There would only be you and him and no one else.
A part of Donnie seems to actually want this sacrifice. A sense of altruism underlines him throughout the movie, none more pointedly than in the poem he presents in his English class.
A storm is coming, Frank says. A storm that will swallow the children, and I will deliver them from the kingdom of pain. I will deliver the children back to their doorsteps. I'll send the monsters back to the underground. I'll send them back to a place where no one else can see them. Except for me. Because I am Donnie Darko.
In this poem, he explicitly says that he wishes for the children of the world to be shielded from all the bad parts of it, while only he has to face them. Yet, he also has his moments of doubt. In the Bible, there is a part of Jesus' story where he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane and prays to be delivered from his impending suffering on the cross. One can see similarities to this and Donnie's therapy sessions where he expresses his fear and doubt for the future and for the worry that he'll be alone. Another interesting aspect of this is Donnie's weakest point when the class is discussing Watership Down.
Why should I mourn for a rabbit like it was human?
Are you saying that the death of one species is less tragic than another?
Of course. A rabbit's not like us. You know, it has no history books, no photographs, no knowledge of sorrow or regret. I mean, I just don't see the point in crying over a dead rabbit.
In this case, we could imagine that the rabbits are meant to be us against the higher powers of heaven, and Donnie is struggling and doubting whether or not we're worth saving, when we often have no greater conception of ourselves, the universe, or the sacrifices made for us. But Grandma Death's book, The Philosophy of Time Travel, explicitly spells it out for us. The living receiver must ensure the fate of mankind, and so Donnie does exactly this. His actions throughout the film ultimately lead to his mother and sister being on the plane that leaves for a dance competition in order to send the jet engine back to the primary universe, and in the process, Donnie accepts his own death so that the rest of humanity may live. Donnie, though he plays a role in cosmic happenings, is ultimately still just a teenage boy. He's rebellious, prone to emotional outbursts, and goes through the classic experience of teen love. Much of being a teenager involves becoming someone far different than you were in your youth. There are times when this change can be dramatic, and Donnie's mom expresses her own frustration at Donnie's increasing negativity.
What happened to my son? I don't recognize this person today.
Likewise, the end goal of growing into a teen and then into an adult is maturity. The maturity in this case being Donnie's acceptance of the responsibility to sacrifice himself for the rest of the world. Emphasizing this dichotomy of Christ-like figure and teenage boy is the way that life moves on after a jet engine crashes into Donnie's house. This is undoubtedly an incredibly crazy event, and something that could have led to his death, yet life immediately moves back into the minutia that one deals with on a day-to-day basis. Additionally, Donnie is very, we'll say, in touch with his teenage boyness.
I think about fucking a lot during school.
One of my favorite parts of the movie that displays Donnie's dualistic nature is the scene of him talking about the Smurfs with his friends. Donnie both has this almost encyclopedic knowledge on this subject and logically deconstructs all the arguments to advocate for the purity of the Smurfs, only to punctuate it with that crass ending. It's a clear demonstration that Donnie has a powerful sense of both logos and pathos within him. Speaking of pathos, Donnie is very much in love with his girlfriend Gretchen. Gretchen is one who has experienced great suffering.
I guess some people are just born with tragedy in their blood.
And yet is willing to persist in life and find happiness in it anyway. When Donnie first asks for them to kiss, she's hesitant. Donnie goes on to accurately guess what's holding her back.
When what?
When it reminds me just...
It reminds you how beautiful the world can be.
Normally you would expect then that Gretchen would want their first kiss to be a sort of finale to a buildup of already wonderful and happy things, but it turns out to be quite the opposite. Their first kiss is a bit of a surprise. Gretchen gets abjectly made fun of for her abusive father and runs from the school in anger and frustration. Donnie chases after her, and it's in this moment that she chooses to kiss him. While at first this perplexed me, it now makes total sense. Often our feelings of happiness and sadness are dependent upon our own perception and context. Something so pure and wonderful as a kiss from someone you love would be the perfect reminder of the beauty in the world when you've just experienced something awful from it. I believe this to be a microcosm of the greater idea that Donnie comes to accept, that despite the tragedies of the world, the existence of sadness is a necessity for the existence of happiness. This is an understandably difficult thing to accept, especially for a teenager, and especially for someone plagued with as many issues as Donnie is. Ultimately, though, it's Donnie's decision to forsake his human desire to preserve himself and allow his own death to occur to save everyone else. Perhaps this comes off as sad or apprehensive. No one really wants to sacrifice themselves, even if they knew it would be for the sake of everyone else's salvation. However, Donnie's own spiritual journey at a level involves the acceptance that God does in fact exist.
Donnie. An atheist is someone who denies altogether the existence of God. You're an agnostic.
And thus Donnie comes to believe that there is some sort of spiritual aspect at play in the universe. There's plenty of hope in this, a promise of life after death beyond the limits of our time on Earth. This obviously isn't a comfort for everyone, especially those who aren't in any way spiritual, but it is for Donnie. If you're someone who's afraid of death, I'm sure this video hasn't convinced you otherwise, and it's entirely possible that Donnie Darko hasn't either. But I believe that there is much to learn from stories of those that find it within themselves to place their duty above their fear, that are able to conquer themselves and perform great acts of selflessness. A great man from up north once said that the only time a man can be brave is when he's afraid. And I believe that everyone has the ability to find bravery in the face of this ubiquitous fear.